Thank you for tuning in to the Logic of God podcast. I'm Cody.
I'm Gina.
And I'm Ben.
If you're returning, thank you for coming back. And if you are a new guest, welcome. So with our Protestant community being like probably our biggest listener base, is there any value to want to make these the level of canon? Do we have to do that for them to be valuable?
I certainly think not. I've been digging into these texts for 3 decades or more now, and I'm perfectly content to be familiar with them, to mine them, to keep returning them, and to look for what they tell me about the world of Jesus and the early Christians, both looking for points of overlap and points of differentiation, because that's another important thing. Reading the Apocrypha alerts us to many of the paths that the early church did not choose, to the nature of zeal for the covenant that might have motivated a Paul the Pharisee, but that ceased to have meaning for Paul the proclaimer of the gospel. I don't think much would change for me if suddenly the Protestants all got together and said, we were wrong. These are good. Let's make them canon.
Well, I do think there's a lot of Protestants who do start out this journey, but then also feel guilty that they're, gaining more spiritual connectedness from reading the Apocrypha, and also finding like a new fire under them with discoveries. And I myself was scared of that going through R.H. Charles Worth's Pseudepigrapha. It's like, okay, this stuff is really interesting and bringing me closer to God. Why am I not getting this out of the Bible? Like, why does this interest me more than Scripture itself?
That seems like a serious problem, Cody. The answer to the second question, I think, is easy. If we have swum in the waters of Scripture for decades, the freshness of a new pond is difficult to resist. And the important thing is to pick a fresh pond that isn't toxic. See, I have no gift for analogy. And the Apocrypha, I think, is a pond that is not toxic. It is a pond that has fed the streams of not only the New Testament, but the whole of the early church, including those centuries that we Protestants own, all the way through Nicaea and the Council of Constantinople and what have you. And I would say you are in good company, because many Christians, and I know this can sound radical, but I look at my Catholic brothers and sisters and Orthodox brothers and sisters as Christians with me. Many of your brothers and sisters have grown closer to God through these texts, and because they are written by people who were close to God. They were written by people who cared deeply about God and about the people's relationship with God, and they wanted their readers to be closer to God and more committed to God's covenant at the end of doing the reading than they were at the beginning of doing the reading. So their effect on you is exactly what their authors had hoped for.
So if I'm just fresh out of reading my Bible 100 times, wanting to explore more into the Apocrypha, what hermeneutical approach would I take to the Apocrypha in relation to the Bible? Do I do it the exact same way? Do I look for the backgrounds of these books, the authors, the time period, the audience that those were geared towards? How would you recommend your hermeneutical approach to Apocrypha?
My own approach. I'll just describe my own approach. And to be honest, it's simply a Protestant approach. It's more a Martin Luther Protestant approach than a kind of modern, I hate the Apocrypha Protestant approach. And so I do not read Ben Sira, the wisdom of Ben Sira, the way I read Paul, or the way I would read Isaiah. But I do read Ben Sira as someone who can tell me a whole lot about Jewish ethics and the importance of the covenant, what's at stake in keeping the covenant, and what have you. So I guess it is, for me, a very different hermeneutic, but an indispensable one. On that score, since I'm allowed to chase whatever rabbit I see.
Chase away.
Thank you. When we read the New Testament and we think about those who oppose Jesus because of their own fidelity to the covenant, or when we think about Paul, the persecutor, for the sake of the covenant, I don't think as Protestants we tend to understand the Pharisees or Paul or, the Jews that do not believe because they think something with the covenant is at stake in following this Jesus. I think it's very important for us to understand that. And reading Ben Sira, for example, really helps us understand that. Reading 1st and 2nd Maccabees really helps us understand what is at stake in this covenant. It's not legalism. It's not externalism. It's a whole lot more. It really is about a living relationship with God on these terms. And so to understand that huge shift that Paul tries to make from living out the relationship with God on these terms to living out a Spirit-led, Christ-centered relationship with God, we really need that background. That's the hermeneutic, I have to confess, that I bring to the Apocrypha. Even though I'm probably the loudest Protestant champion of the Apocrypha, it still basically is material that I mine for what it can tell me about the canonical books and the environment out of which they arose. I find them inspiring. I read 4th Maccabees. Heck, I don't just read it. I wrote a commentary on it. I'm one of 4 people alive on the face of the planet who has written a commentary on 4th Maccabees. That's what kind of nerd you have in this room.
God bless you.
I tell you what. One of 4 people who's written a commentary, one of 8 people who cares.
Oh, no.
But I read that and I am inspired by it to the mastery of the passions, the same mastery of the passions that Paul pushes us toward in Galatians 5 and emerges elsewhere throughout the New Testament as a goal. Of course, for the author of 4th Maccabees, it was the keeping of the Torah that enabled mastery of the passions. For us, it is walking in line with the Spirit and the empowering of the Spirit that makes that possible. It's inspiring. It's inspirational literature. And in that regard, though, the hermeneutic is what I would also bring to C.S. Lewis.
So if you approach Apocrypha with a background study or like a background mentality, what can this book tell me about the New Testament authors or Jesus himself and his life on this earth? Do you feel it's the same as doing like Old Testament background study? Like that, with a lot of the archaeology now, there is more reading of, the Babylonian tablets and getting the archaeological finds that are happening currently. Would you say that's the same with the Apocrypha, just a purely background study, no moral or spiritual value in it? Or can you glean some moral and spiritual value out of the Apocrypha?
So, I think there is certainly moral and spiritual value to it. The same way there's moral and spiritual value to C.S. Lewis.
Okay.
The Old Testament as background. I have to confess, I suppose, I also approach the Old Testament largely from the point of view of a New Testament professor. So I'm reading it to understand what is in the background of the temple cult in Jesus' day and what have you. I'm not reading it to understand what gives purity rules and pollution taboos their meaningfulness for the Jews who observe them in Jesus' day. I'm not necessarily reading them to be inspired by them.
That's fair.
We're back to Leviticus. This is Leviticus bashing. Stop bashing the Apocrypha, darn it.
Well, look, nobody calls their local priest for mold growing in the corners of their house anymore. Like, obviously, there are things in Leviticus that we don't find all that inspiring. It is very helpful to learn a lot of the things of the Old Testament and give us some background for the New. But I do think that there are absolutely inspirational things. I mean, obviously, why would they revisit books like Daniel or Esther if there was no sense of inspiration from them, no idea of importance? But is there anything in the Apocrypha that you would say is more valuable to you personally, that you find more inspirational? And is there anything that you were like, I don't like it?
So you're talking about like the content of all of the 18 books that might be published in an Apocrypha these days?
Yes. Which one do you like and which one do you not?
All right. Top 10 list. So I find Wisdom of Solomon to be very important, very inspiring. It would probably be my number one. And that's because it lays out in its first 5 chapters, a very, I would say, sophisticated kind of existential analysis of what happens when you don't believe in life after death and what happens when you do believe in life after death, and what kind of life on this side of death these two mindsets nurture. And then in its middle section, it develops the figure of wisdom, familiar, Lady Wisdom, familiar from Proverbs 8, but it does so in ways that cannot help but bring to mind passages in Hebrews 1, Colossians 1, and the first chapter of John, where suddenly you hear some of these topics being used to talk about the pre-incarnate life of the Son of God. And you begin to think, oh my goodness, this was the raw material of Christology in the making from the year 50 on. So Wisdom of Solomon, very excited about that one. Tobit might be a second, in large measure because it takes us into just the practical world of living out the covenant in family life in sort of a diaspora Jewish setting. And again, because it has such a profound influence on some New Testament books and then on early church writings ever after. Then Ben Sira might come third. Now, Ben Sira has a big problem. He's paranoid about women. He doesn't know what to do with them except keep them locked up and keep an eye on them. Because he is the poster boy for male chauvinism in the Second Temple period. And even a rabbi commented that is lamentable that Ben Sira said what he did about women, because otherwise we could comment on him like the other books. Like the one thing that disqualifies Ben Sira from being right up there on the scriptural list is the fact that he was such a chauvinist pig. But once you set that aside, once you take those passages out, just like Jefferson did to parts of the Bible he didn't like, there is such a wealth of insight there into what it meant to keep the law and how essential it was for this Jerusalem sage to implant in his students a commitment to the covenant, so that as they negotiated their life in increasingly Hellenized and cosmopolitan Jerusalem, they would not forget who God is and forget who they were. Fabulous book. And I don't know, I the only book of the Apocrypha that I really have no use for is First Esdras, to be perfectly honest. I hate that book.
Tell us how you really feel.
I thought I should keep it clean.
At least PG-13. But
And that's probably because I'm not a big fan of Ezra and Nehemiah to begin with. And in large measure, it's I find that passage or that moment when somehow fidelity to the covenant means you need to put away your wives and disown your children to be just so bloody distasteful. All those broken homes created in an instant for the sake of keeping the bloodline pure. Now, I know that has some value. And I'm sure some Old Testament scholar somewhere sees it.
that's why you're in the Old Testament now, yeah.
But that's, it's... but other than that, they all have so much to to show us. Second Esdras, it's not really anyone's Deuterocanon. It's in our printed Apocryphas. I'm trying to remember how it got there. It is included in an appendix to the Vulgate. So Second Esdras is called Fourth Ezra in the Vulgate. And that shows us a Jew wrestling in about 100 AD with the fact that Jerusalem was destroyed. But Rome goes on to prosper as if it had done no wrong. Where is the God of justice? How is God going to bring justice? And so it's a marvelous work of theodicy, reflecting on the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem. And it leads to some chapters that provide, I think, one of the best comparative texts for studying the book of Revelation. I don't know. I just, except for First Esdras, I don't know. They're all great.
What is it with Esdras and Baruch that it seems like everybody picked them for their pseudo writings? Like, I think going through the Charlesworth, there was like 5 Baruchs and then like an apocalypse of Baruch and a lot of Baruch.
A lot of Baruch.
And there's a lot of Esdras, I believe, too.
There are a few, yeah. So, really, Cody, you're getting into the question of pseudepigraphy. The word for the day is pseudepigraphy.
Brought to you by the letter P.
I know, right? What's up with that? Brought to you by the letter Psi. So it became a thing to write under the name of an historic figure of the past. Jews did it. Early Christians did it. And among mostly the Jewish authors, figures like Enoch pop up as possibilities, Ezra, Daniel, Baruch, as you say. And in part, I think this is an attempt of the author to link his work and his setting with a comparable one, to say, I stand in this tradition, or what this historic figure faced illumines what we're facing. And especially then with Ezra and Baruch. These are 2 well-known scribes, sages, from around the time of the destruction of Jerusalem and the reconstruction of a Jewish state, or just a Jewish identity in the wake of destruction. And so after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, Ezra and Baruch offer a point of connection with Jewish experience in the past and the ways in which we have survived this kind of catastrophe before. That's all I got.
Awesome.
Can I ask my questions? I have a list.
Yeah, go for it, Gina.
You've answered some of these already, kind of just in conversation. So I specifically want to highlight some of your writings. I would love to know what resources you have written that our listeners can refer to or purchase so that they can learn more from your perspective of just a healthy relationship with Apocrypha.
Well, thank you. I've written a few books on this collection. For those who kind of want an initial dive, I would recommend a short book I wrote called The Apocrypha, because I have no imagination. And it was published by Abingdon Press in 2012. It's part of their Core Biblical Studies series. But it basically introduces readers to the fact of the collection and where it came from, the historical period out of which these various texts arrive, and then kind of works thematically through the books of the Apocrypha to talk about what they say about the covenant, what do they say about the relationship of Jews to the nations, what do they say about Jewish ethics and Jewish eschatology, hope for the future, and what have you, and then closes with some material on the use of the Apocrypha in the early church and how we got to the state where we have all these Old Testaments of different sizes, the XL Apocrypha, the double X, and then our Protestant medium Old Testament, medium sized. And then for those who want a deep dive, I brought out a second edition of my Introducing the Apocrypha with Baker Academic Books in 2018. And that will work through all of the texts of the Apocrypha one by one and try to give a sense of the historical setting out of which they arose, what are the contents, and in many instances, kind of what are the most important things we learn through these books about theology, the ethics, the kind of social realities of the Second Temple period. And then every chapter concludes with the influence of this book on New Testament authors where applicable, early church, ongoing life of the church through the centuries.
Awesome. Thank you. Are there any other resources that you recommend outside of your own writings that you think would be useful?
No, buy mine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Sorry, I couldn't help it.
Well, you're a professor, so I'm sure you have a wealth of resources.
So there are, of course, others. Focusing on the Apocrypha, there's also very recently the Oxford Handbook of the Apocrypha, which is a stellar collection of essays. The only trouble is it's only available in hardback right now, which puts the price point at $150. But I'm sure it will show up in paperback down the road, which will bring it down to about a third of that. That's an excellent collection. And then, people need to read the Apocrypha itself. Mm-hmm. Good heavens, that's where we should be starting. So I think the best single edition of it is the New Oxford Annotated Apocrypha, which is in its 5th edition, which you can buy from Amazon. And it has all the texts of all 18 books. So the Roman Catholic Deuterocanon, plus the Eastern Orthodox Deuterocanon, plus a few extra tag-alongs, just, free bonus. Bonus reel Apocrypha, with good annotations throughout. And those are important, especially the first time through a corpus. Good introduction to each book and annotations. And then Cody had mentioned R.H. Charles before. If you're really just strapped for cash and don't have money for books, well, clearly you need help with budgeting because books are the most important thing to buy. But if you don't have cash, you can actually just download the 2 volumes of R.H. Charles's 1911 and 1915 Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha of the Old Testament. Now, of course, its annotations do not benefit from any scholarship after World War I, which was a while ago. But on the other hand, it does give you access to the most important Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha and annotations that were, how shall I say, the cream of the crop for 1913. So,
okay. My one big question for today is, what's so bad about just using sermons to learn about God?
Have you listened to most sermons?
I'm asking it for somebody else.
Asking for a friend.
So, sermons are very good to listen to learn about God and what God expects of us. But they don't do everything. If they did, well, we wouldn't need Scripture itself. We wouldn't need C.S. Lewis. We wouldn't need the wealth of devotional Christian literature that is available to us. How shall I put it? There is no preacher or circle of preachers that we're going to listen to that will introduce us to the full treasure that is ours in our heritage. And so, I would urge everyone to value not just the Apocrypha or the Pseudepigrapha, which we really haven't gotten into too much, but that's fine. The Apocrypha is enough to chew on probably for most people for a while.
For those who haven't keeled over from shock yet.
That's right. But I mean, there's so much more. The Apostolic Fathers, for example, a collection of early Christian writings from, let's just say, between about 96 AD to 150 AD. Those are rough. But what happened in the generation after the New Testament? How was the word carried on? These are inspirational documents. Why would I not want to read them? What about the sermons of John Chrysostom, a fabulous a preacher and bishop of the 5th century in I think, Constantinople? What about the Imitation of Christ by Thomas A. Kempis? What about The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer? And all these others. All that to say, what's wrong with just listening to sermons to grow in faith? Well, what's wrong with only eating kale and nothing else?
To garnish.
Well, yeah, kale's disgusting. Bad analogy.
So are most modern preachers, is what you're saying.
No, I'm not.
No.
Not at all.
I don't think that's a bad analogy at all, though. It's like there's nothing wrong with kale in and of itself, but if it's the only thing you're taking in.
You're a rabbit.
Not a rabbi.
Okay, we're done here.
Once we slip in the rabbi jokes, there's no turning back. So you mentioned the writings of the early church fathers. Would you consider those to be of equivalent value to something like the Apocrypha? Like, we don't need to really put it on a scale, but in terms of things that a Christian should read to be fed, would you say that the Apocrypha takes a unique place and that it's slightly above, let's say, in a sense, the writings of the church fathers, which are in many ways just sermons?
They are, well, let's see. I want to say that they are very, very different and serve very different goals. And the analogy I'm thinking of is a horrible one because we all know that only the original trilogy movies matter.
Where are you going with
You
this?
see where I'm going. You see where I'm
I don't
going.
know if she does, but I think we do.
Please proceed with caution, but go ahead.
Yes.
We're going to lose half our listener base.
So the Apocrypha is valuable as the prequel trilogy, but the Apostolic Fathers are valuable as the sequel trilogy. Only a whole lot better and less derivative. So this is all a Star Wars geek thing, because the three guys are laughing, ha, 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 because we're geeks. So the Apostolic Fathers have a very different kind of value. They're kind of sermons, but they also show us that next generation of the faithful. And forgive me if I've said this already, but how this next generation contends for the faith once for all delivered to the saints. And that has its own kind of power and inspiration, not least because two of these apostolic fathers died for their faith, Ignatius and Polycarp. They were martyred. Ignatius wrote all of his letters on the way to martyrdom, for example. So that's powerful. I think I lost the question.
So in comparison, the purpose of the Apocrypha, while it is, you would consider also inspired in the same sense that those sermons would be inspired, it serves a different purpose. So what would be that purpose?
Yeah, that purpose is to immerse us more fully in that world out of which the gospel emerged, so that we can understand Jesus against his background better. I think one of the things that reading the Apocrypha has done for me is make me understand just how much more of Jesus' Jewish environment in terms of its ethical teaching Jesus embraced. He appears to be much more of a piece with the thought world of Judaism if you've read the Apocrypha than if you stop reading with Malachi. And then you think everything new that you encounter in Jesus is something that differentiates Jesus from his Jewish environment. But as I said before, his teaching on the necessity of forgiving one another if you want God's forgiveness, the idea of almsgiving as the way to lay up a treasure in heaven, teachings like this, that's already out there in the airwaves of Judea and Galilee. And Jesus has embraced it and made it part of his teaching. So that's different. But also the other side, where does Jesus, where do his apostles draw the lines differently from their peers? knowing where the writers of the Apocrypha were reinforcing lines really helps us see those shifts more clearly.
Yeah, I agree. I think when Jesus goes and he gets baptized, he says it's to fulfill all righteousness. The audience there doesn't go, okay, but what is righteousness? They seem to have a foundational understanding and expectation of the Jewish version of righteousness, and Jesus claims to fulfill it. So obviously everything that he stood for shouldn't be novel. But I do think that we as Protestants do tend to look at Jesus and say, see, he's separate. There's all this Old Testament stuff and he's completely different and he blew the old world away. But he doesn't say that he was there to destroy the law. He was there to fulfill it. So yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of wisdom in what you're saying, and that the purpose of the Apocrypha is filling in that, 400-year gap, more or less, that intertestamental period where we're not really getting much scripture, but that isn't to say nothing was happening. There was a world of change happening. And I do think that we've many of us as Protestants, not to say that all of us, but many of us do just kind of point to that section and say, I guess nothing happened. God abandoned them.
That blank page between Malachi and Matthew. And that's another question, God abandoned. No, because, and the Apocrypha and some of the pseudepigrapha are witnesses to the fact that many pious Jews knew the presence of God still to be alive and active, and called their co-religionists to embrace the path of covenant loyalty in light of that.
And I bounce back to the question about why it's not okay to just rely on this sermons. I've heard sermons personally firsthand that have said, like, the intertestamental period, nobody was paying attention to God. And there's just a lot of misinformation when you don't have the richness of the history, like the family history,
Yeah, you actually, you bring up an important point. A sermon is only as good as the preacher's education, the time the preacher put into the sermon in the midst of all the preacher's other duties. Yeah. Sometimes that doesn't all add up to something all that good.
No, but I spent years thinking that the intertestamental period was just dead. And it wasn't. And my eyes were opened, and it was a wonderful moment for me of realization, but I wouldn't have had that without the Apocrypha.
So what would you say then is an individual Christian's personal responsibility in seeking this kind of workout?
This kind of workout.
As in the Apocrypha or the pseudepigrapha, finding things outside of the Bible, building their own faith up in fear and trembling with these works outside of what we would call Scripture. What's our responsibility to that? Because if we rely purely on our sermons, we're not going to be fed in that way. We're clearly not being pointed in that direction. What's our responsibility?
For some reason, what comes to mind is that old maxim, faith-seeking understanding. How hungry are you? How much do you really want to know about Jesus, the man, his world, his message, his followers, the tensions and challenges they faced, the decisions that they made? If you're hungry to know that, you will immerse yourself in the literary witnesses to that world. And if you're not hungry to know that, you won't. You'll read some light devotional literature and you'll flip through Netflix. Ouch.
You'll stay on milk until you're ready for the solid food.
You'll stay on milk until you're on Enfamil. No, until you're on
Pediasure?
No. What do geriatric people end up
Ensure?
Ensure. You'll stay on milk till you're on Ensure.
Oh, no.
Oh, dear.
I'm starting to get snarky.
No, that's good.
We enjoy a good amount of snark, and we are very critical of the Protestant church. We've had episodes where we're critical of Catholic and Orthodox traditions, but we're also excessively critical of the Protestant faith. And that's a big reason why we started this podcast. We see a lot of people existing with no substance, and we want to help people like Cody and Ben who have very analytical minds, who can't just say, oh, you just got to believe. And so that's really the meat of the podcast.
Wow.
Calling people up. I do have to add one last question. What is your opinion on the Shepherd of Hermas?
So For listeners who have not read The Shepherd of Hermas in the last 3 months, this is one of the Apostolic Fathers. It may have been written as early as 96 AD because the author refers to Clement, who is known to be active in Rome at the end of the 1st century. And it is a long book, but it was highly valued in the early church. So highly valued that it shows up in one of the Septuagint manuscripts of the Bible, not as part of the Bible, but as a big fat appendix to the Bible, along with the Epistle of Barnabas. So if you're thinking, wow, what was a great early Christian devotional classic, you should think Shepherd of Hermas. So what do I think about it? It's rambling. He really needed an editor.
Yes.
Wow, did he need an editor? Yeah. But aside from that, it is full of good ethical teaching. And of course, it also raises some questions. For example, it starts off with a more or less visionary portion, written to inspire, to help Christians in the face of imminent persecution to stay faithful and pay the cost. And it raises the possibility that you can fall away once and be restored a second time, but never again. So it raises questions. Well, is that really true? Is there that kind of limit or what have you? But apart from that, it's just nothing but really good, if rambling, ethical instruction.
So would you recommend still a good read?
Still a good read.
Awesome.
Especially the first 75%. It's going to be hard to make it through the last 25. I'm not going to lie.
You can just have a hard cutoff at the 75.
Yeah, the visions. There's 4 visions in it.
And then a whole bunch of commands or instructions, which are great. And then the so-called parables or similitudes. And the first 7 are tight and well written.
Yeah.
Out of 10. 8 and 9, though, is like, whoa, you passed a lot of good exits. Like many sermons, you missed a lot of good places to stop.
Yeah. We tell our kids, you don't have to say everything you think.
That's true. Any closing remarks? You're currently working, or you currently just finished your Pauline book.
Yeah, I've been immersing myself in a different kind of context for the last couple of years. Kind of the archaeological remains of important New Testament sites. And this is something that's occupied me off and on since 2011, when I made my first visit to Turkey and spent 10 days between Ephesus, Smyrna, and Pergamum, just having my mind blown by how much it helped me think about the situation of John the seer, John in Revelation, and his congregations to actually be in the places of the Christians that Revelation addressed. So yeah, I just finished Archaeology and the Ministry of Paul for Baker Academic. And these are going to be great because like half text, half photos, 250 photos are going into that book. So,
oh, goodness.
So finally, right, a book with pictures.
And they're worth 1,000 words. So that's like the longest book ever written.
I tell you what, that went to press in March. So it should be out by March or April 25. And then right now I'm trying to finish Archaeology and the Ministry of Jesus. So focusing on Galilee, Samaria, Judea, and how archaeological discoveries there and artifacts there help us really wrap our minds more closely around the lived world of Jesus and his first followers and his opponents.
Yeah, those sound great.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So be on the lookout for those.
I'm excited.
Well, thank you all for having me on your podcast. This has been a fun conversation.
Absolutely. And for those of you listening at the end who've been with us the whole time, thank you so much. And this is Dr. David deSilva. And is there any place that people can find you and the works that you've written?
Well, it depends. If they like me, they can find me at Ashland Theological Seminary, which is where I teach, professor of New Testament there. I'm sorry, the other?
Any place they can find your works? You have a website? Or
I do have a website. It's... Do you have a website?
Yes, we do.
Yes, we do.
So all my information can be posted maybe with this podcast on your website.
Absolutely.
That's the place to do it.
Yeah.
We'll be posting a link to Dr. deSilva's website. And if you guys are interested, you can go and take a look.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to our podcast today. If you liked what you heard, please feel free to subscribe and share and leave a positive review. And if you would like to connect with us on social media, you can do so on Instagram and Facebook at The Logic of God. You can also send us an email at main.thelogicofgod@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening. We hope you have a great day.